Book Review Part 2, Persuasion, a Revolutionary Way to Influence and Persuade, a discussion with mediator Sylvia Mayer. Part of the series, Mediation Book Review. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hey everyone, this is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sylvia Mayer. I'm an arbitrator, mediator, and attorney located in Houston, Texas. Thanks for having me.
Hey,
Our
Sylvia.
pleasure.
Hey, good to have you again. It's always so much fun to get with you and discuss things, whether it's bankruptcy law or, in this series, more books that you have read and taken really good pieces of wisdom from to help you be a better mediator and conflict resolution expert. So, let me set the stage. Wanted to go back in time and screen share a little bit to show folks who might be watching. If you're listening to this podcast, please check out the YouTube video version. Some months ago, it's been a while, we did a episode with Sylvia on Pre-Suasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade. It was a book by Robert Cialdini, who basically talks about how you prime people and set them up to be ready to resolve their conflict, or to be ready to receive your ask, to be ready to receive the proposal that you might make, so that they can hopefully agree with you and make peace with you. And so this is a book that was filled with pieces of wisdom that Sylvia gleaned from it, and she shared it. Check it out on the channel whenever you get a chance if you want to hear Sylvia's thoughts from the first session. Now we're in part 2, and we're going to continue on with Sylvia as we discuss some of the points from this book. And be sure to check out Sylvia's website, which is going to have an article where she talks about her insights from the book. The first one was posted in April 27, 2022. And the second one, part 2, was posted on the 4th of July. And so thank you, Sylvia, for doing all this work, for bringing it to our attention. And so now, did you want to do a quick little recap from the first one and then segue to the second one? Or do you just want to get into the meat of the second one?
Sure. I think it's helpful to do a quick recap, not so much on the details that we focused on the first time, but really to focus on what's the central theme of the book. And the central theme of the book is receptivity. And the concept of receptivity is that in order for people to be open to accepting new ideas, thoughts that are different from their own, or in the context of mediation, potential resolution of a dispute, and recognizing perhaps weaknesses in their position or opportunities that they hadn't perceived before, they have to be receptive. They have to be open to receiving that information. And so when I read Cialdini's book, Pre-Suasion, from the perspective of a mediator, I was reading it from the perspective of what's in this book that I can take away and use to help people solve their problems, help people resolve their disputes. And so in our first session, we talked about 3 different takeaways that I had from the book. But there's so much in this book. I highly recommend it to anyone who likes to read, whether you're a mediator or not. It's a fantastic, thought-provoking book. But today we're going to talk about 3 other topics that I found were really powerful points, and I've really integrated into my thinking as a mediator.
So, back to these fantastic words that we are going to explore on today. I just wanted to start. Previously, we were talking about the word choice, focus, and connection. And today, we are, I understand, to focus on trust building, timing, and reciprocity. Starting with trust building, um, I understand that even if we are trying to sell something to somebody, we are trying to gain their trust first. But how does that work for in mediation? It does. I mean, we are taught during the training that, of course, you need to be gaining the trust, building the trust with the parties as soon as you see them, that the opening statement also serves this purpose. But what does Cialdini say about this?
So it's really interesting. So Cialdini, throughout the book, he uses real world experiences, studies, scientific research, all sorts of different source materials to substantiate his theories. And in the context of trust building, one of the examples he gives really fascinated me. He really dissects the letter that Warren Buffett includes in the annual Berkshire Hathaway report. And he does it by saying that you receive this letter, and even though you know this man is a multi-billionaire running this extraordinary investment fund, you connect with him and he gains your trust. It's a trust building exercise to read this letter. And so it's really fascinating. He goes through it. And for example, he says, he starts out, Warren Buffett in the letter, almost always by acknowledging a mistake that either he or his company made in the prior year. And that really lays the foundation for building a connection, for trust building with investors. Why does that lay a foundation for building trust? Well, if you think about it, when someone admits that they made a mistake, that there was something that they did that was wrong or was an error, they're vulnerable, they're open, they're relatable, they're aware, they're honest, and all those things give them credibility, but also helps us feel a connection with them and helps us feel more comfortable with them, that they're going to continue to be those things with us. They will continue to be honest and relatable and credible in our exchanges going forward. And it was really very interesting to me to think about it in that way, that sometimes what we need to do is admit something. Sometimes what we need to do as a mediator is be vulnerable in order to help people feel comfortable and safe in the mediation, and to help them build trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, sticking on to this first topic of trust building, one of the lines in your article actually is discussing trust deficits and how people come to mediation with a trust deficit. And how many times, as a mediator, I'm telling one of the parties, you guys just don't trust each other. And because I do mainly family law mediations, that then tends to portend bad omens for the future, where we know the child's going to be the one who's suffering because the parents are not on the same page. Every motive, every decision, one of them makes, the other one second guesses it and attributes bad motivations to it. And so if you have any trust, you're not going to have any good potential outcomes. So that's extremely important to help find ways to rebuild, a trust factor between the parties. And I think in a practical level, this sometimes is why we like to do temporary agreements to see how people will work things out. But if you do a permanent agreement, for example, but you haven't addressed the trust issues, um, it might fail in a number of months. But if you do a temporary agreement and allow the parties to have time to build trust over time, then when they come back to you for a second mediation, it might work a whole lot, smoother, because of the fact that they weren't locked into something forever. They were able to basically test out the agreement. And I think as mediators, we need to do that more of that, help people build trust from the agreements that we help them put in place. Okay, so what about the next one?
Well,
Timing.
hold on. I want to follow up
Oh,
on something you just said, because I think this is a really critically important thing as mediators for us to consider. people come to mediation with a trust deficit, as you said, but they also come to mediation and there I am, a complete stranger. And they don't, I mean, how do they trust me? They've never met me before.
Yeah.
And so a big part of what we do as mediators is trust building. My sort of thinking has evolved on this. I think trust building is really about safety and connection and not actually creating real, viable, long-lasting trust. And I think that's an important distinction for us to keep in mind. And it goes to the point that you were just making, Mac, that as in the context, and I don't do family law mediations, but in the context of, say, a business divorce, where a business is not going to continue, and so you're negotiating, you're mediating between two parties who have this connection. You're trying to help them find that thing that can help them move forward, even if they may never trust one another again. And so I think sometimes we get lost in the idea of they must trust in order to get there, but that we have to let that go and find that it's more, there needs to be trust building, and there need to be guardrails that allow them to feel safe and comfortable with whatever agreement has been reached, even though there may continue to be a trust deficit. So I think that it may be a semantic distinction, but I think it's an important distinction for us as mediators to keep in mind, because it helps us remember that part of that settlement we're negotiating needs to include these kind of guardrails.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Yes. And so we're moving on to timing and the importance of that. Can you speak to what timing is in the context of the book and why it's important to mediators?
So timing comes up in mediation in a lot of ways. First, I want to start by sharing one of the examples that Cialdini uses in Pre-Suasion. Totally unrelated to mediation. His example focuses on what would happen if you're in a business setting and you're going to a brainstorming meeting. And it's going to be you and several other of your peers and a decision maker. Some people think, oh, I want to sit next to the decision maker because that's the seat of power. And some people may think, I want to speak right before the decision maker, because then they'll hear me, because I'll be right next to them and they'll hear me. And Cialdini says both of those thoughts are wrong. And the reason they're wrong is because human nature is that before we speak, before it's our turn to go, we're rehearsing in our head what we're going to say. After we speak, when the next person's talking, we're not hearing them. We're rehashing what we said. We're maybe thinking we could have said that different, or wait, I need to follow up on something. But those two spots, speaking before or after the decision maker, are the worst two spots to speak, because they're not going to actually hear what you have to say. And he also, as part of this discussion, talks about where you sit and says, don't sit next to the decision maker either, because first of all, that probably means you're going to talk right before or right after. But also, it's harder for them to see you. You want, going back to a point we discussed in our last conversation, you want to be focal. You want to be where they're looking. You don't want them to have to turn in order to see you. And that really was eye-opening to me when I started thinking about, how does that play out in mediation? So obviously in mediation, there's not a jockeying for position of who's going to speak first or second when I'm meeting with a party. Because at least I as a mediator, other than preliminaries and ground rules and things, I always start by saying, I want to hear from you first. But it never occurred to me before that I unknowingly had stumbled into a technique of persuasion, right? Because I know they've got all this stuff in their head and they need it to come out of their mouth first. And so I give them that opportunity to let them say whatever they need to say. And then I usually wait and pause for a second, make sure they're finished, maybe ask a few questions. And at least the approach I use as a mediator is my first session with each side in a caucus is a listening session. And I don't provide any feedback. And it never occurred to me until I read this in Cialdini's book, that I stumbled into exactly what he's saying. Because I don't give them any feedback in that session, I'm not competing for their attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But timing play comes out in mediation in a lot of different ways. And we as mediators know that timing is critically important, right? People need time to work through the process. People need time to become receptive. You're always gauging as a mediator, are they ready? Are they receptive now? But the point I wanted to make with this particular aspect of his book is that we have to think as mediators about the timing of when we share, when we provide people feedback, when we ask questions versus when we provide input or challenge them or probe. So I don't know. What are your thoughts? What have y'all seen as mediators when you're working with parties? How does timing play out in that context for you?
Sometimes you see that the parties are competing who is going to be the first to say something. Sometimes they are on contrary, reluctant to say a word, like fearing that the one who goes first, I don't know, is on a lost position, let us say. So a part of that will be also to encourage people to speak at all. Again, intersecting with trust building. But I understand that there are also people who really speak very quickly and don't mean what they really say. I think that this timing can also have the effect in mediation on that. And that also requires from the mediator to react appropriately to someone who's already said if too much, if not say really enough.
I think that's really an important point, is that it's incumbent on us as mediators to recognize when maybe somebody's not being authentic in the comments they're making and find the right timing to push back on that, and to probe that a little bit. In my experience, sometimes people are saying things that may or may not be true, but they don't realize that. And they need gently probing questions to help them shift their mindset to start recognizing that, oh, wait, maybe I misunderstood that. Maybe I took that the wrong way. Maybe I missed an important piece of information. And it's another way that timing plays out in mediation is we are always, as mediators, always gauging the right time to do those kinds of things.
Yeah. So the takeaway is not to speak too soon because a person may not be processing what you're saying, but not to speak too late or not to, well, don't speak too early and don't speak too soon after, basically, right? That you have to think through, consider human nature and what the decider, might be processing in their minds at that time. Okay.
Absolutely. And that really takes us to the third point too, because human
Mhm.
nature is at the heart of all of this.
Yeah.
So as you just said, you have to consider human nature when you're talking, because you have to recognize whether they can or can't hear you, whether they're in a moment where they can actually focus on what you're saying. But the third point I wanted to talk about, which is a really important point that Cialdini makes in his book, is reciprocity. So what's reciprocity? If you think back to when you were a small child, maybe you're playing Legos with your friend and you have too many red Legos and they have too many blue Legos. And so you say to your friend, I really need a blue Lego. Can I give you one of my red Legos and I'll trade you for a blue? I give you something, you give me something. That's reciprocity. So we see this in mediation all the time, because we see people say, I'm going to make a big move now, and I expect them to follow. Reciprocity, right? But it doesn't always work out that way for them in mediation. And here's where all of this ties together. Why? Why is it that reciprocity doesn't always happen instantaneously in a negotiation or a mediation? Timing and receptivity. So I may be willing ultimately to make a big move, but I'm not willing right now because I don't have enough information to help me get to that point, because I haven't processed my emotions yet to get to that point. Because for me, psychologically, I can't make leaps to the degree you want me to make, whatever the variables may be, you need to find the right timing so that they're receptive to reciprocity. And the reality is reciprocity is embedded in virtually every culture around our world. It is such a basic fundamental principle that we learn as children. Someone who gives a benefit gets a benefit in return. That it ultimately will be triggered, but it's just a question of finding the right timing and making sure that they're receptive to the reciprocity that you're seeking.
And having said that, that will be the time to close up for now. And thank you so much, Sylvia, for all these insights. I really think that we should be concentrating in our work, but also in approaching the outside world on those three concepts as for this episode, which will be trust building, timing, and reciprocity. And we are looking forward to our next episode with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.